My name is Angela Williams, and I am 52 years old. When people meet me now, when they see the lines etched around my eyes, the tired sway in my walk, they often assume the years alone carved me into this shape. And in some ways, they are right. But the story of who I am and how I came to be this woman sitting in a quiet kitchen on the south side of town begins more than 2 decades ago, on the day I became a widow. I was 30 then. 30 and suddenly hollowed out, with 2 children clinging to my legs like little shadows. My husband, David Williams, left for work one morning wearing the same worn jacket he'd put on 100 times before. He kissed me quick on the cheek, coffee in one hand, lunch pail in the other, promising he'd be back in time for dinner. That promise broke before noon. A construction accident, they said, faulty scaffolding. A fall. One of those tragedies you hear on the evening news, the kind that makes strangers pause and mutter, "Lord, have mercy," before returning to their own supper tables. Only for me, mercy didn't come. For me, it was a police officer at the door, his eyes soft with pity, hat in hand, as my children watched from the hallway, too young to understand why their mother had collapsed onto the floor. That was the moment I stopped being Angela the wife and became Angela the widow. A title I never asked for, a role I had to inhabit whether I was ready or not. Marcus was 8. Brianna was only 5. They looked up at me with those wide, questioning eyes, waiting for me to explain why Daddy wasn't coming home. How do you explain absence to children that small? How do you wrap death into words simple enough for them to hold without shattering? I told them what mothers always tell their children, that Daddy loved them, that he was in heaven, that we would be okay, even when I didn't know if we would. Especially when I didn't know. In the years that followed, survival became a language I learned fluently. I picked up jobs the way some people collect hobbies. Nights, I worked as a nurse's aide at the county hospital, scrubbing in and out of patient rooms, steadying hands that trembled with sickness. Mornings, I scrubbed floors in office buildings, pushing a mop across tiles that shone for people who never learned my name. Afternoons, I cooked in other women's kitchens, feeding children that weren't mine before rushing home to feed the ones who were. There was never enough money. Rent slipped through my fingers like sand. Bills stacked on the counter in little accusing piles. Some months I counted coins at the grocery store checkout, praying my children wouldn't notice how close we came to empty. I stitched clothes until my fingers ached. I stretched soup with water. I bartered overtime for Christmas gifts that fit inside paper stockings. Still, through all of it, I held onto one simple truth: my children would not be denied. Marcus, with his stubborn streak and clever mind, loved to argue over everything from curfews to cartoons. I saw a future lawyer in him long before he did. Brianna, soft-spoken but fierce underneath, carried a sketchbook everywhere she went. She drew dresses on napkins, on old church bulletins, even on the backs of my medical bills. I told her she would grow up to design the kind of clothes we could never afford. Everything I did, every hour worked and hour lost, was for them. I wanted to build a bridge with my body so they could walk to a place I could never reach. Sometimes, in the lonely hours after midnight, when my feet throbbed and my back screamed from bending too long, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of cheap tea and whisper to the dark, "Lord, just let me make it through one more day. One more day for them." I don't think I was ever particularly brave. What I was stubborn. Too stubborn to give up. Too stubborn to let life snatch away the only good things it had ever given me. There were sacrifices, of course. I missed school plays because the night shift couldn't be traded. I skipped birthdays because another family's dinner table needed serving. There were mornings when I kissed my children's foreheads as they slept, knowing I wouldn't see them awake for another 24 hours. Do you know what it does to a mother's heart to watch her children grow in photographs more than in real time? It carves you out, piece by piece. You tell yourself it's temporary, that someday all this work will mean something. You hang onto that belief the way a drowning woman hangs onto driftwood. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the years passed. Marcus grew tall, his voice dropping into the register of men. Brianna bloomed into a young woman with her mother's cheekbones and her father's smile. The grief that had once been raw and jagged softened around the edges, though it never disappeared entirely. By the time I turned 50, the mirror showed me a stranger. Hair peppered with gray, hands calloused from labor, shoulders stooped under invisible weight. But when I looked past that reflection, I saw what mattered. 2 children, now adults, standing at the edge of their own futures. A lawyer, a designer, proof that my sacrifices had not been wasted. Still, there is a kind of loneliness that lingers, even when you have children. Especially when you have children, because they do not remain children forever. They become people of their own, with dreams that take them far from your kitchen table. And sometimes, late at night, I would wonder if anyone saw me, not the mother, not the worker, but Angela. The woman who once laughed with her husband over burnt pancakes. The woman who once danced barefoot on a summer lawn. The woman who had lost as much as she had loved. This is where my story begins, not with the grief of losing a husband, nor with the exhaustion of raising 2 children alone. But here, at 52, standing on the threshold of something I did not expect. For all the sacrifices and the scars, life had one more twist waiting for me. And as I would soon learn, the greatest challenges are not always the ones you see coming. I never imagined kindness would find me at the side of a hospital bed. Yet that is where the next turn in my life began. I was working the night shift, the kind of shift where the fluorescent lights never dim and the halls echo with the beeping of machines more than the sound of human voices. My feet ached inside my old white sneakers. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and fatigue. By then, I had grown used to the rhythm, push the cart, check the vitals, smile at the patients even when my body begged me to sit down for just 5 minutes. That was when I first met Richard Campbell. He was not like most of the patients who passed through our ward. Wealth clung to him, even when he lay in that narrow hospital bed with an Roman IV taped to his arm. His pajamas were pressed cotton, not the flimsy gowns we gave everyone else. Fresh flowers arrived every morning, brought by people who called him sir and whispered in the hallways as if the man inside was too important to disturb with ordinary voices. I didn't know his story at first, only that he had undergone heart surgery and his recovery was slower than the doctors expected. He had a quiet sadness about him, the kind of look that lingers in the eyes of someone who has lived long enough to lose more than he wanted. My job was simple: change his bandages, check his pulse, bring him water, make sure the monitors were steady. Yet somehow, with him, it felt like more than a job. Maybe because he always thanked me, not the quick, distracted thanks most patients give. No, he looked right at me, his voice steady, his gratitude genuine. "Thank you, Angela," he'd say, as if remembering my name mattered. One evening he asked, "How long have you been doing this?" "Too long," I joked, though the truth was closer to my whole life. He chuckled, then coughed, his chest rising with effort. I steadied the glass of water in his hand, and for a moment our eyes met. There was recognition there, not of who I was, but of what I was, someone tired, someone who had carried more than her share. Days stretched into weeks. His recovery dragged on, but so did our conversations. He told me about his late wife, Margaret, a woman he described with reverence, like a saint who had once walked among men. They had no children. "We thought there'd be time," he admitted once, his gaze fixed on the sterile ceiling. I told him about Marcus and Brianna, though carefully, the way you do when you're proud but don't want to sound like you're boasting. He listened, really listened, asking questions, remembering details. He laughed when I said Marcus could argue with a wall, and he shook his head in admiration when I described Brianna sketching gowns late into the night. "You've raised them on your own?" He asked one night, disbelief softening his voice. Yes, I said simply. There was no need for a speech. The exhaustion on my face told the story for me. He studied me for a long moment, then said something I did not expect. You must be extraordinary. Extraordinary. The word felt foreign in my ears. For 22 years I had been called many things: strong, hard-working, resilient. But extraordinary, no one had ever placed that crown upon my head. When he was discharged, I thought that would be the end of it. Patients leave. Life continues. But a week later, a letter arrived at my apartment. A real letter, handwritten in neat cursive. Richard thanked me for my care, but more than that, he invited me to dinner. At first, I laughed. A dinner invitation from a man like him to a woman like me? I almost tore the letter in half, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me in the hospital, as if he saw not just a nurse's aide, not just a tired widow, but a whole person. I accepted. The restaurant was nicer than any place I had ever stepped into. White tablecloths, soft violins, glasses so delicate I was afraid I might break them just by touching. I wore my best dress, the navy one I usually saved for church, but even then I felt out of place, as though the walls knew I didn't belong. Richard arrived in a tailored suit, yet his smile was easy, unforced. He stood when I approached, pulling out my chair like a gentleman from another era. For the first few minutes, I couldn't shake the thought that this was a mistake. But then he started asking about me, not just the polite questions, but the kind that carry weight. What kept you going all these years? What do you dream about now that your children are grown? Dreams. The word almost made me laugh. Mothers like me don't dream, we survive. But under the soft glow of that restaurant light, with his eyes waiting patiently, I admitted the truth, that I dreamed of rest. Of seeing my children flourish without me standing behind them, pushing. Of a little house where the roof didn't leak and the neighbors knew my name. That dinner led to another and then another. Before long, Richard was no longer just a former patient. He was a presence in my life. He met Marcus and Brianna, showering them with a generosity I didn't know how to accept. He paid off Brianna's school loans. He introduced Marcus to colleagues in law. He said it was nothing, but to me, it was everything. And yet, with every blessing he offered, I felt the weight of unease growing. My children began to look at him differently, Marcus with a hunger he tried to hide, Brianna with a mix of admiration and suspicion. I told myself to be grateful, to stop searching for cracks in the kindness. But a part of me, the part that had spent years fighting alone, couldn't help but wonder, what happens when fortune walks into a poor woman's life? Does it lift her up, or does it tear apart the family she fought so hard to keep together? At 52, after decades of sacrifice, I should have known the answer. Life never gives without asking for something in return. It is a strange thing to watch your children's faces change in the presence of money. When Richard first entered our lives, I told myself it was a blessing. After so many years of struggle, wasn't it fair that some ease finally found us? I imagined Marcus relieved from his endless burden of proving himself. I pictured Brianna free to design without worrying about overdue rent or student loans. I thought we could all breathe together, perhaps for the first time. But blessings, I've learned, carry shadows, and shadows lengthen quickly. Marcus was the first to change. My boy, my stubborn, argumentative boy, began to wear a different smile when Richard came around. It was a smile too sharp, too polished, as though he had practiced it in the mirror. When Richard spoke of law, Marcus leaned in with a hunger that unsettled me. He asked about connections, about firms that might be hiring, about the quickest way to climb ladders he had only just begun to step upon. I wanted to be proud. I told myself it was ambition. But in the quiet of my kitchen, I knew it was something else. Ambition grows from the soil of hard work. What I saw in Marcus was more like desperation, a frantic reaching for fruit that wasn't his to pluck. Brianna, on the other hand, bloomed under Richard's attention. He admired her sketches, those swirls of fabric and color she had carried in notebooks since she was a little girl. He spoke of investors, of fashion houses, of turning her ideas into a brand. Her eyes lit up in ways I hadn't seen since she was a child. Yet beneath that glow, I caught flickers of something sharper. Jealousy, perhaps, that her brother might step into opportunity before she could. Or suspicion that Richard's generosity was a mask for something neither of us could see yet. Our dinners, once simple affairs at my small wooden table, grew complicated. Richard insisted on taking us out, white tablecloths again, waiters whose shoes clicked softly across marble floors. The kind of places where I always felt my hands were too rough, my dress too plain. Marcus thrived there, slipping into conversation with Richard's colleagues as if he belonged among them. He ordered expensive wine with an ease that startled me. Brianna watched, her jaw tight, sketching silently on napkins while Marcus laughed at jokes I didn't understand. And me? I sat between them, smiling, pretending this was what I wanted. A family lifted, a family seen. But inside, I felt the earth shifting. One night after such a dinner, I heard Marcus on the phone in the living room. His voice was low, urgent. "No, I swear I'll have it by next month. Just give me time. I've got someone who can help me." The pause stretched long, his hand gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles whitened. I stood in the hallway, hidden in shadow, listening to a side of my son I did not recognize. When he hung up, I stepped forward, but he caught sight of me before I could speak. "Mom," he said quickly, "it's nothing, just a friend." But it wasn't nothing. I knew the sound of a man bargaining with debt collectors. I had heard it before in the early years after David's death when neighbors whispered about loans they could not repay. That kind of desperation has a tone you never forget. I wanted to press him, to demand the truth. But when I looked into his tired eyes, I saw the boy who once clutched my hand on the first day of school, afraid to let go. I swallowed my questions and said nothing. With Brianna, the changes were quieter, more subtle. She spent long hours in her room, sketching gowns with a ferocity that worried me. Sometimes I'd peek in and find her whispering to herself, rehearsing answers to questions no one had asked yet. One evening, she slammed her sketchbook shut as I entered, her eyes wet with tears. "What is it, baby?" I asked. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. Then, after a pause, "I just don't want to be a charity case." The words pierced me. I wanted to tell her that Richard's help did not define her, that her talent was hers alone. But the way she looked at me, defiant, wounded, made me realize she wasn't talking about Richard at all. She was talking about me. About the life she had grown up in, the hand-me-downs, the nights without, the sacrifices that marked her childhood. In her eyes, maybe I had made her a charity case long before Richard arrived. That night, I lay awake in bed, the ceiling cracked with shadows. I thought of David. What would he say, watching our children pulled apart by the very things we thought would save them? He had once told me, on a warm summer night when the kids were small and the bills were piling high, "Angela, money's just a tool. But people, they'll cut each other with it if they are not careful." At the time, I thought he was speaking of neighbors, of co-workers. I never imagined he might be speaking of our own children. As the weeks passed, Richard's presence grew. He called often, visited on Sundays, brought gifts too grand to refuse yet too heavy to accept without guilt. A silver watch for Marcus. A sewing machine imported from Italy for Brianna. For me, bouquets of lilies, though I confessed once that daisies were my favorite. "Daisies are too ordinary for you," he said with a smile. Extraordinary. There was that word again. And yet, the more extraordinary he made us feel, the more ordinary our family life became. Silence at the dinner table. Jealous glances traded between siblings. Conversations that ended before they began. I began to understand something I had never wanted to face. Love binds families, yes, but so does struggle. Without it, the seams loosen. Without it, people forget the weight of what they carried together. One evening, as I folded laundry in the quiet of our home, Brianna came to me. She sat on the edge of the couch, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. "Mom," she said softly, "do you ever worry he's going to take us away from you?" The question startled me. "What do you mean?" "Richard, he gives and gives, but sometimes I think maybe he doesn't want to just help us. Maybe he wants us to belong to him." I stared at her, the shirts in my lap forgotten. She was voicing the fear I hadn't dared to name. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her she was wrong, but all I could do was reach for her hand, squeezing it tightly, as if that gesture alone could hold us together. Because deep down, I knew something had begun to shift, something I could not control. And shadows, once they take root, are not easily pulled out by the light. When Richard invited us to his home for dinner, I told myself it was just another kindness, another gesture from a man who had already given more than I could ever repay. Still, I felt a tremor inside me, the same nervous flutter I used to feel walking into a church where I didn't know anyone. His house was not a house at all but an estate. White stone walls stretched wide like arms open to receive you. A fountain spilled water in the driveway, glistening under a row of lanterns. The air smelled faintly of roses, though I could not see a single bush in the dark. I wore the same navy dress I had worn on our first dinner, my best, my only best. Marcus and Brianna dressed sharper than I'd ever seen them. Marcus in a pressed suit he admitted sheepishly was borrowed from a friend, Brianna in a cream dress she'd sewn herself, the stitches as delicate as lace. Richard greeted us at the door, his smile bright, his voice booming with welcome. Behind him, servers moved like shadows, placing trays of drinks and hors d'oeuvres on silver stands. The chandeliers glittered above us like constellations, making me feel small and dazzled all at once. "You belong here," Richard whispered to me as he let us in. "Don't ever forget that." But as I looked at my children's faces, Marcus wide-eyed, Brianna chewing her lip, I wasn't sure belonging was something you could inherit so easily. The dinner was a parade of plates I couldn't pronounce. Roasted quail with fig glaze, lobster tail with saffron cream, dessert served in glass dishes that sparkled like jewels. I ate slowly, carefully, afraid of misplacing a fork or spilling sauce across the tablecloth. Marcus, on the other hand, came alive. He laughed louder than I'd heard in years, matching Richard's tone, inserting himself into conversations with men in tailored suits and women draped in pearls. I watched him sip champagne as though it were water, his cheeks flushed, his words flowing faster with each glass. At first, I wanted to be proud. My son at ease among the powerful, but the more he spoke, the more his words stumbled, and the more I recognized the edge in his voice, the kind that comes when a man wants something too much. "So tell me," Marcus said to one of Richard's partners, leaning across the table with a boldness that made me clutch my napkin, "what does it take to really make it in your world? Connections, investments, a little risk." The man raised an eyebrow, amused, while Richard gently cleared his throat, steering the conversation away. Brianna sat quiet, her fork resting untouched beside her plate. She flipped open her sketchbook when she thought no one noticed, her pencil moving furiously. Once, Richard leaned over to see, and her cheeks flushed when he praised her lines. "These are remarkable, Brianna. You have real vision," he said warmly. She smiled, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked to Marcus, who by then was gesturing wildly with his glass. The evening carried on, a dance of laughter and clinking glasses, but under the glitter of chandeliers, something darker pulsed. I could feel it: envy, hunger, unease. Later, after dessert, we moved into the drawing room where a piano played softly in the corner. Richard excused himself briefly, and I stood by the window, looking out at the manicured gardens bathed in moonlight. That was when I overheard Marcus. His voice, hushed but urgent, carried from the far side of the room where he spoke with one of Richard's acquaintances. "I just need a chance. I can make it work, I promise. My mother trusts Richard, he'll back me if I ask, you'll see." I froze, my stomach tightening. And then a different voice reached me, Brianna's, low and trembling, speaking to one of the women near the piano. "I just don't want to be his project," she murmured. "I don't want my work to mean less because of his money." Two voices, my children's voices, carrying two different weights, one reaching too far, the other shrinking back, both caught in the gravity of a man whose fortune was pulling us apart. When Richard returned, I plastered on a smile, but my heart was already heavy. The evening ended with handshakes and hugs, promises of future dinners. Marcus stumbled slightly as we walked to the car, his laugh still echoing from the hall. Brianna walked ahead, her shoulders stiff, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. In the back seat, Marcus hummed off-key, tapping his fingers against the window, while Brianna stared straight ahead, silent. I sat between them, the mother who had once held their small hands, the mother who had once believed that sacrifice alone could keep them safe. But as the lights of Richard's estate faded behind us, I realized something I could no longer deny. Money was not saving my family. It was testing it. And though I smiled to reassure them, inside I whispered the same prayer I had whispered for years. "Lord, let me make it through one more day with them. One more day before everything slips away." I could not sleep the night after that dinner. The house was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak of pipes in the walls. Marcus had stumbled into bed smelling of liquor and arrogance, while Brianna locked her door, the scratch of her pencil faintly audible until midnight. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the weight of my own heart. Money was not saving us. It was stretching the cracks wider. And yet, I didn't know how to stop it. Richard's generosity felt like a river that wouldn't be dammed. I wanted to believe in it. I wanted to believe in him, but the faces of my children told another story. It was a week later, on another evening at Richard's estate, when the whisper reached me. Dinner had ended, the guests had left, and Richard had stepped away to take a phone call in his study. I lingered in the dining room, helping a young maid clear the last of the plates. That was when an older man, his butler, I assumed, approached me. He had been serving Richard's household for years, his posture straight, his hand steady despite the lines of age on his face. "Mrs. Williams," he said softly, glancing around to be sure we were alone. "Yes," I answered, startled by the gravity in his eyes. He hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful." I frowned. "Excuse me." "Be careful, ma'am," he repeated, his words urgent but hushed. "Not everyone here wishes you well. Not everyone welcomes the idea of you belonging." I felt my breath catch. "What are you saying?" He shook his head quickly, as if already regretting his words. "I've said too much, forgive me." He stepped back, bowing slightly, before hurrying toward the kitchen. I stood frozen, the weight of his warning pressing against me like a stone on my chest. Not everyone wishes you well. The words clung to me all night. At first, I told myself it was jealousy. Perhaps some of Richard's staff resented me, a woman from nothing stepping into their polished world. But deep down, I knew the whisper was not about the servants. It was about something larger. The signs had been there if I'd cared to see them. A week before, my prescription pills had gone missing. I had blamed myself, thinking I'd misplaced them, though I could have sworn I set the bottle beside my bed. Days later, they turned up in the kitchen drawer, tucked between dish towels I rarely used. Then there was the car. On my way home from the market, the brakes had felt strange, softer than usual. The mechanic later told me one of the lines was loose. He fixed it without charging me, shaking his head as though the mistake was too careless to believe. I didn't tell Richard. I didn't tell my children. Instead, I carried the suspicion like a secret I was afraid to unwrap. One evening, while clearing dishes at our own small table, I finally spoke to Marcus. "Son," I said carefully. You've been distant lately. Is everything all right? He looked at me sharply, too sharply. Of course, Mom. Why do you ask? Because you seem, I paused, searching his face, restless. He laughed, the sound brittle. Restless? I'm just trying to get ahead. You wanted this for me, didn't you? You worked yourself half to death so I could succeed. Now I finally have a chance and you're worried. His words struck me like a slap. I opened my mouth to answer, but he was already on his feet, grabbing his jacket, muttering something about meeting a friend. The door slammed before I could say another word. Later that same week, I found Brianna in the living room, surrounded by scraps of fabric and half-finished sketches. Her eyes were swollen as if she'd been crying. "What's wrong, baby?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She shook her head, then whispered, "I feel like I'm being watched." "Watched? By who?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's just in my head, but sometimes when I'm at Richard's, I feel eyes on me, like someone wants me gone or worse." Her words echoed the butler's warning, and for the first time, fear crawled through me like ice. I held her close, stroking her hair as if she were still the little girl clutching crayons in church pews. "You're safe," I lied. "I won't let anything happen to you." But as I whispered those promises, I remembered the loose breaks, the missing pills, the whisper in the dark. And for the first time in years, I realized that survival might not just mean holding my family together. It might mean keeping us alive. The whisper haunted me for days. I replayed it each night when the house was still, when the only sound was the ticking of the clock above the stove. Be careful. It was a warning, but it was also a confession. Someone knew more than I did, and that knowledge sat like a storm cloud over my family. But it wasn't the whisper that finally shattered me. It was Marcus. It was late, past midnight, when I heard the knock at our door. Not the polite rap of a neighbor, but the hard, insistent pounding of someone who did not care who they woke. I pulled my robe tight around me and hurried to the living room, my heart hammering. When I opened the door, two men stood on the porch. Their clothes were plain, but their eyes were sharp. One of them smiled without warmth. "Mrs. Williams?" "Yes." My voice came out thinner than I wanted. "We're looking for Marcus." "He's asleep," I said quickly. The man shook his head. "Wake him, he owes us." Behind me, I heard movement. Marcus, bleary-eyed, stood in the hallway. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I once tucked in with storybooks. But then his shoulders squared, his jaw tight, and he stepped past me. "I'll take care of it," he muttered. One of the men leaned close. "You'd better, or your mother will be the one paying next." I felt my breath stop. My son didn't argue. He simply nodded, slipped on his shoes, and followed them into the night. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the empty space on the couch where he should have been. When he finally returned, his face was pale, his tie askew, his hands trembling. He dropped into a chair, burying his face in his palms. "Marcus," I said softly, sitting across from him. "Tell me." At first, he shook his head. But then the words poured out, ragged and raw. He had been gambling for months. At first, it was small, bets on games, the occasional trip to the casino. Then, when the wins came, he convinced himself he was smart enough to keep winning. He borrowed money he didn't have from people he shouldn't have touched. He told himself the next win would clear it all, but the wins dried up. The debts didn't. "I just wanted to fix things, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I wanted to give you back everything you gave me. I thought if I could make one big score, I could pay off your bills, buy you a real house, prove I wasn't just your burden." My burden. The word split me in two. "Marcus," I said, my throat aching, "you were never my burden, you were my reason." He looked at me then, eyes bloodshot and wet. "But I failed, and now I've dragged us all into this mess. If Richard knew, maybe he could." "No." The word left my mouth like a slap. He blinked, startled. "You will not use Richard to clean this up. You will not trade your soul for his money. We'll find another way." "Another way?" he asked bitterly. "There is no other way. They'll come after me. They'll come after you." His words shook me because I knew they were true, but I also knew something deeper. If Marcus tied himself to Richard out of desperation, we would lose more than money. We would lose the last piece of ourselves. I reached across the table, taking his trembling hands in mine. Son, listen to me. I've fought too long to keep this family alive. I won't let these men or this debt or even Richard decide who we are. You will face this. You will work. You will climb out of it with your own strength. Do you hear me? He lowered his gaze, ashamed, but he nodded. For a moment, I believed it might be enough. But as I watched him retreat to his room, shoulders heavy with secrets and shame, a new fear gnawed at me. Desperation makes men reckless. And my son was drowning in it. That night, long after he closed his door, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small medicine bottle I'd hidden in the cupboard. The pills were back in their place now, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But I remembered the whisper, the breaks, the missing pills. Someone wanted me gone, and someone wanted my son desperate enough to ask Richard for help. The two truths pressed against each other until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And for the first time, I wondered, was the danger outside my family's walls, or was it already inside? The morning after Marcus's confession, the air in our home felt heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of his secret. I moved through the day with my body but not my mind, washing dishes, folding laundry, nodding at Brianna's questions, all the while replaying his words. My burden. My failure. How had my son grown up believing that lie? How had my love, poured out like water every day of his life, still left him thirsty? But I had no time to untangle those questions, because Richard arrived that evening with news that would shift everything once again. We were sitting on the porch when he leaned closer, his hand warm over mine. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and violet. His voice was steady, but his eyes searched mine with something fragile behind them. Angela, he began, I've been blessed with more than I could ever need, but wealth means nothing when there's no one to share it with. You've brought light back into my life. I don't want to waste another day pretending I can live without you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath caught. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, a single diamond that caught the fading light like fire. I'm asking you to marry me, Richard said. His words were firm, yet gentle, like an invitation rather than a command. To let me be part of your life and for you to be part of mine. To build something together, not just for us, but for Marcus and Brianna too. For a long moment, the world narrowed to the box between us, to the trembling of my hands, to the memory of David's face as he kissed me goodbye on that long-ago morning. My heart ached. Could a widow love again without betraying the man who had first taught her what love meant? Could I step into a new life without erasing the one I had lost? I whispered the only truth I knew. I don't know. Richard's hand tightened over mine. You don't have to answer tonight. Just know that my love is here, waiting. He kissed my cheek softly before leaving, his car pulling away into the dusk. I sat on the porch long after, the ring box heavy in my lap like a stone I wasn't sure I could carry. It was Brianna who found me there. She saw the box before I could hide it, and her face changed instantly. "What is that?" she demanded. I opened my mouth, but she snatched the box from my hand, flipping it open. When she saw the diamond, her eyes widened, not with wonder, but with fury. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, Mom, tell me you didn't say yes." "I didn't," I said quickly. I told him I needed time, but my words did nothing to soften her. "How could you even consider it?" she cried, her voice breaking. "After everything Dad did for you, for us? He gave his life to that scaffolding to this family, and you're ready to throw him away for—" "Stop," I snapped, sharper than I intended. The word hung between us like a crack of thunder. Tears welled in her eyes, but she pressed on. "You always told us we were enough, that we didn't need anyone else. And now you're willing to let some rich man waltz in and replace him, replace Dad, replace us." Her words struck deeper than any knife. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that no one could replace David, that no one could replace my children. But as I looked at her trembling hands, clutching that ring box like evidence of my betrayal, I realized this wasn't about David. It wasn't even about Richard. It was about her fear of being left behind. "Brianna," I said softly, reaching for her, but she pulled away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "You've already lost one husband. You think you can survive losing us too?" She slammed the box shut and shoved it into my hands. Then, with tears streaking down her face, she turned and stormed inside. Moments later, her bedroom door slammed, rattling the thin walls of our home. I sat there on the porch, stunned, the ring box still burning in my palm. I thought love would heal us. I thought Richard's proposal might be a new beginning. Instead, it had cracked the fragile shell of our family even wider. Inside the house, Marcus's muffled voice carried through the hallway. He was on the phone again, low and hurried, making promises he couldn't keep. Upstairs, Brianna wept into her pillow, convinced her mother had chosen someone else over her. And me? I sat in the dark, caught between the man I once loved, the man who wanted to love me now, and the children who seemed to be slipping from my grasp no matter how tightly I held on. For the first time in years, I felt like I was drowning. And this time, I wasn't sure if love alone could save us. The days after Richard's proposal were a blur of silence and slammed doors. Brianna would barely look at me, her sketches left crumpled on the living room floor like discarded prayers. Marcus kept vanishing at odd hours, his phone glued to his hand, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. And me, I moved through it all like a ghost, the unopened ring box hidden in my dresser, pressing against my conscience each time I laid a blouse on top of it. It was on a Thursday evening that the night came, the one I will never forget. Richard had invited us again, this time to a quiet dinner, just the four of us. He said he wanted to smooth the air. I wasn't sure if he meant between himself and Brianna or between me and the past. The restaurant was dim, elegant, the kind where candles flicker in crystal holders and the walls hum with whispered conversations. We sat at a round table draped in white linen, the silverware gleaming under the low light. I ordered cranberry juice, as always. My blood pressure couldn't take wine, and I'd long ago given up explaining myself to waiters who raised their brows. For a while, everything seemed normal. Marcus joked too loudly, filling the air with nervous laughter. Brianna stayed quiet, sketching on the edge of the menu, her lips pressed tight. Richard, ever the gentleman, tried to bridge the silence with stories of his travels. Then my phone buzzed. It was Jessica, my lawyer and oldest friend. She rarely called at dinner unless it was urgent. I excused myself, promising I'd only be a moment, and stepped into the lobby where the signal was stronger. We spoke briefly about documents from the sale of Richard's latest property. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth remembering. But when I returned to the table, something inside me shifted. My glass of cranberry juice sat waiting. The color looked the same, the condensation beading at the rim. But when I lifted it, I noticed faint residue at the bottom, a thin cloud swirling like dust in sunlight. My hand froze. I set the glass down carefully, my smile never faltering. "This is a little sweet," I said lightly. "Would you mind bringing me another?" The waiter nodded and whisked it away. I forced myself to keep talking, my eyes flicking between Marcus, Brianna, and Richard. None of them seemed to notice, or maybe they noticed too much. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of half-swallowed bites and strained laughter. When we parted on the sidewalk, Brianna hugged me tightly, her voice soft against my ear. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. For a moment, I almost believed it, but the chill in her hands lingered long after she let go. I waited until their car disappeared before I slid into mine. My fingers trembled as I reached for the ignition. That was when I heard the knock on my window, soft, urgent. It was the waiter. He leaned close, his face pale in the glow of the street lamp. "Forgive me for intruding, ma'am," he said, his voice low, "but you need to know when you stepped away, your daughter poured something into your glass." My stomach dropped. I didn't want to believe it, he continued, glancing around nervously, but I saw her take a small vial from her purse. Her husband kept watch. My hands went cold. "Are you sure?" I whispered. "I've worked here 15 years, he said firmly. "I don't meddle in customers' lives," but I couldn't stay silent. People who do things like that, they're dangerous. From his pocket, he pulled a sealed plastic bag. Inside was the very glass I had set down. "I saved it," he explained, "if you want it tested." I took it with trembling hands, my voice breaking. "Thank you." He nodded once, grave, before disappearing back into the restaurant. I sat there for a long time, gripping that bag, the world tilting around me. My daughter, my only daughter. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't shadows or whispers. It was truth, solid and undeniable, sealed in glass and residue. Tears blurred my vision, but they were not the tears of grief I expected. They were colder, harder, because in that moment, something inside me died and something else was born. A fury sharper than any blade, a resolve stronger than any mother's mercy. If Sarah in that other story had been blinded by greed, then Brianna was no different. My little girl, the one I carried through storms, the one I sacrificed my youth for, had looked at my life and decided it was worth less than money. As I drove home that night, the sealed glass beside me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer just a mother fighting to protect her children. I was a woman preparing to defend herself from them. I didn't sleep that night. The glass sat on my kitchen counter, sealed tight in that plastic bag, the residue still visible at the bottom. I stared at it as if it might rise up and speak. My daughter's hands had held that vial, had tilted it toward my drink. My daughter's eyes had watched, waiting for me to swallow. Morning came gray and heavy. I drove the sample to a private lab across town, the kind of place that asked no questions when you laid a wad of bills on the counter. "I need this tested today," I told the technician. He hesitated, then nodded, sliding the bag into the back. While I waited, I sat in a cafe nearby, nursing coffee that tasted like ash. My phone buzzed. Marcus. "Mom, you okay?" His voice was unusually tender. "You looked tired last night." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just a little off." He exhaled, relief in the sound. But I heard something else beneath it, a thin tremor, guilt or fear. "Don't push yourself, okay? Rest today, you deserve it." I hung up quickly before my voice betrayed me. By mid-afternoon, the lab called. The technician's voice was careful, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, the concentration of propranolol in that glass is 10 times the normal dose. For someone with high blood pressure, well, it could have been fatal." My knees buckled. Fatal. The word echoed through me like a bell tolling at a funeral. I drove straight to Jessica's office, the report clutched in my trembling hands. She read it silently, her mouth a thin line. "Angela," she said at last, "this isn't suspicion anymore. This is evidence. You can go to the police." But I shook my head. The thought of my daughter in handcuffs, my family's name in the papers, strangers debating our shame, I couldn't bear it. "Not yet," I said. "I need to understand why. I need to hear it from them." That night, I confronted Marcus. He was at the kitchen table, head bent over stacks of bills and half-crumpled notes, trying to hide the mess. "Marcus," I said, laying the report in front of him, "do you know what this is?" He read the first lines, his face draining of color. "Mom, don't lie to me." My voice was sharper than I'd ever let it be. "Did you know? Were you part of this?" His eyes darted, panic rising. "No, I swear I didn't know she." He stopped, biting down on the words too late. "She." The room spun. "Brianna." He buried his face in his hands. "Mom," she said it was the only way. She told me we'd all be better off. That Richard's money could fix everything. The debts, the shame, the years of scraping by, She said you wouldn't suffer, that it would look natural, your heart, your blood pressure. My heart clenched, but not from sickness, from betrayal, my son, my daughter, whispering in corners, plotting my end like I was an obstacle instead of the mother who had bled for them. I steadied my voice, though it trembled with rage. And you agreed? Marcus lifted his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. No, Mom, I told her no, but I didn't stop her either. I didn't have the strength. I thought maybe if it happened, the debts would vanish and Richard. I slapped the table, the sound cracking through the air. Richard is not your salvation, and I am not disposable. He flinched, his sobs breaking. I'm sorry, Mom, I don't know who I am anymore. I turned away because if I kept looking at him, I might crumble. Upstairs, Brianna's door was shut. I stood outside. The report clutched in my hand, my knuckles white. I could hear faint music, the scratch of her pencil, as if she hadn't just tried to erase me from her life. I wanted to storm in to demand answers, but my legs refused. My throat burned with questions, but my heart already knew the truth. Instead, I whispered through the door, my voice low, steady. Brianna, I know what you did. Silence. The music stopped. For a moment, the whole house held its breath. Then her voice came, soft, almost calm. Then you know why. I staggered back as if the words themselves had struck me. No denial, no shame, only a cold justification. I walked to my room, closed the door, and let the sobs tear through me. The children I had worked my fingers raw for, the ones I had raised alone, had weighed my life against money and found me lacking. That night, as the house slept, I sat at my desk and wrote in my journal. My hand shook, but the words came clear. If they want me gone, they will learn what it feels like to lose. Not by my death, but by my will. They will lose me, but not the way they planned. And they will remember the cost of betrayal. For the first time in my life, I felt something colder than grief, sharper than love. I felt the stirrings of revenge. The morning after Marcus's confession and Brianna's chilling words, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. Her face was mine, lined, weary, streaked with gray, but her eyes were something else entirely. Cold, steady. A clarity I had never known lived there now, born from betrayal so deep it had burned away hesitation. I thought of all the years I had bent my back for my children, how I had carried them like lanterns through the dark. And yet, when the first flicker of wealth appeared, they had chosen to douse my flame. They thought they knew me. They thought my love made me soft. They had forgotten that love can also make a woman strong enough to do the unthinkable. By noon, I was sitting across from Jessica in her oak-paneled office. The toxicology report lay between us, its black and white print stark against the polished wood. She didn't need to read it again. She had memorized every line the moment I'd handed it to her. "What do you want to do, Angela?" she asked. I drew a breath. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "I want a new will." Jessica's brows rose slightly, but she said nothing, only reached for a pad of paper. "You'll leave it all to the foundation?" she asked. "Most of it," I said. "Enough to honor David's name, enough to ensure that something good comes of all this, but not everything." She leaned forward, her pen hovering. "Then what? I want you to draft a second document, a confession, detailed, signed, witnessed. If anything happens to me, anything, those papers go straight to the police." Jessica studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "You're certain?" "I've never been more certain," I said. "If my children want to inherit my death, they'll inherit the truth with it." The next day, I asked Jessica to call Marcus and Brianna. "Tell them we're meeting at your office," I instructed. "Tell them I've reconsidered the foundation money." When she raised an eyebrow, I added quietly, "They'll come running." And they did. The morning of the meeting, I dressed in a gray suit I hadn't worn since David's funeral. It was plain, severe, without a hint of softness. I pulled my hair back into a tight bun, no lipstick, no jewelry. I wanted them to see me as I was, not the mother who had coddled them, not the widow who had bent her back to keep them alive. but a woman standing on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Jessica met me in the lobby, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "They're already here," she said. "They seem nervous." "Good," I replied. "Let them be." When I entered the conference room, Marcus rose quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Brianna remained seated, her arms crossed, her sketchbook closed before her like a shield. "Mom," Marcus began, "you look well." "I am well," I said flatly. "It's amazing what clarity can do for the body." Jessica sat beside me, opening a folder thick with papers. Her voice was calm, professional. "Helen asked me to gather you here to discuss adjustments to her financial plans." At that, Brianna's posture shifted, her eyes sharpening with interest. Marcus leaned forward, his hand drumming nervously against the table. "As you know," Jessica continued, she had initially planned to place a significant portion into the David Foundation. "Too much," Brianna blurted, her voice trembling with forced lightness. "I mean, of course, it's her choice, but—" I raised a hand, silencing her. "Actually, I've been reconsidering." Their eyes lit up, hope, greed, relief. It flickered across their faces faster than they could hide it. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone calm, deliberate. "I realize there are more important things than I imagined, things that only become clear when you've been close to death." Marcus froze. Brianna swallowed hard. I reached into my purse and slid a folder across the table. "Do you know what this is?" Brianna stared but did not touch it. Marcus glanced nervously at Jessica. "It's a toxicology report," I explained. "From the cranberry juice I didn't drink, the one you tampered with." Silence fell heavy. Marcus opened his mouth, but Jessica cut him off. "Don't bother denying it. We have witnesses. We have evidence." Brianna's eyes darted, her face pale but defiant. "This is ridiculous. You're twisting things. Why would I ever?" "Because money," I interrupted, my voice rising for the first time. "Because years of sacrifice weren't enough. Because my life meant less to you than the fortune you thought you'd inherit." Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I leaned forward, my voice low and sharp. "You have two options. First, I call the police right now. With what I have, they will convict you. You will rot in a cell for the rest of your lives. Or second, you sign the confession Jessica has prepared. You put in writing what you did, every detail, every motive. That confession will sit in a safe. If anything happens to me, it goes straight to the authorities. And in return, you disappear. No more calls, no more pleas, no more chances. You leave my life forever." The color drained from Marcus's face. Brianna's jaw tightened, her eyes burning with cold calculation. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Fair?" I snapped. "Fair was 22 years of my life spent breaking my body to raise you. Fair was the roof over your head, the clothes on your back, the food in your mouths. Fair was love so deep it nearly killed me, and this is what you chose to repay me with." Marcus slumped forward, his hands shaking. "Mom, please," but I did not bend, not this time. Jessica slid the documents across the table. "Decide," she said crisply. "Now." For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. Then Brianna reached for the pen. Her hand shook as she scrawled her name across the pages. Marcus followed, his tears dripping onto the paper. When the signatures were done, Jessica collected the documents and placed them in a locked folder. I stood, my knees trembling but my spine straight. "It's over," I said. "You'll pack your things, you'll leave this city, and you will never, ever come back." They didn't argue, they couldn't. As I walked out of that room, my heart was heavier than stone. I had not chosen between justice and mercy. I had chosen both and neither. Because I knew the truth. My children were already gone. What I left behind in that office were not signatures on paper, but the funeral rites of a family I had spent my life trying to hold together. When I left Jessica's office that day, the air outside felt sharper, as though even the wind knew something inside me had broken. I had walked in as a mother clinging to hope. I walked out a woman who had buried her children in the quietest funeral imaginable, a funeral of trust, of family, of love. The house was emptier after they left. Marcus and Brianna packed quickly, avoiding my eyes, and within 48 hours they were gone. No note, no backward glance. Just silence. For weeks, I moved through the rooms like a stranger. I would stand in the hallway, staring at the closed doors of their bedrooms, remembering the laughter that once spilled out of them, the arguments over curfews and borrowed clothes. Now, only dust gathered in their place. Grief pressed down on me, heavier than when David died. His absence had been a tragedy carved by fate. This loss was carved by choice, my children's choice. And that was a wound no prayer, no doctor, no passage of time could ever fully close. It was Jessica who finally pulled me out of the shadows. She showed up one morning with a folder full of proposals for the David Foundation. "You can sit here mourning what's gone," she said gently but firmly, "or you can build something new out of what's left." At first, I resisted. What could I give to the world when my own family had collapsed? But then I thought of David, of the way he used to talk about giving back once we made it. He never got the chance, but maybe I could. So I began. I poured my energy into the foundation, into scholarships, shelters, programs for children who had lost parents, children who still deserved a fighting chance. It did not erase the pain, but it gave it purpose. Slowly, the nights grew less suffocating. Slowly, I began to breathe again. And then life surprised me once more. Her name was Lily. She was 25, a medical student working on heart research. Bright eyes, quick smile, and a gentleness that disarmed me. She came to me one afternoon with Jessica at her side, holding her hands nervously. "Mrs. Williams," she said softly, "I think I might be your granddaughter." At first, I couldn't speak. The words didn't fit in my ears. But then she told me her story, how Brianna had given birth at 17 and hidden it, how Lily had been adopted by a kind family in Ohio, how she had found her way back to me through the foundation. I stared at her face, searching for proof, and there it was in the curve of her cheek, in the way her eyes lit when she smiled. A piece of Brianna, but softer, purer, untouched by the poison of greed. Tears filled my eyes as I reached for her hands. "I lost my children," I whispered, "but maybe God gave me another chance through you." From that moment on, Lily became a light in my life. We cooked together, laughed together, dreamed together. She reminded me that family can be found, not just born. That love, when given freely, can heal even the deepest fractures. A year later, the David Miller Children's Home opened its doors. I stood at the entrance, scissors in hand, surrounded by children who would sleep in warm beds that night instead of cold shelters. Jessica stood beside me, smiling with quiet pride. Lily was there too, holding the hand of her adoptive mother, who welcomed me as if I had always belonged. When the ribbon fell and the children ran inside, their laughter ringing through the halls, I felt something shift. Not the return of what I had lost, but the birth of something new. I was no longer just a widow, no longer just a mother betrayed. I was a woman who had turned sorrow into shelter, who had found love in places she never thought to look. And as I watched Lily bend down to tie a little girl's shoelaces, I thought, maybe this is what survival really means. Not clinging to the past, but daring to begin again. Dear friends, thank you for walking this journey with me, through grief, betrayal, and finally toward hope. Life is not always what we expect, but it always offers us the chance to rise, to love again, and to rebuild. I wish you and your families health, peace, and the kind of happiness that endures through every trial. Treasure each other, forgive when you can, and hold tight to love, because in the end, it is the only fortune worth keeping. With gratitude, Angela.